Alright, so I'm Brody Blades, and I was assigned Chapter 6, An Uncivil Society. The first section is titled Dubai Has No Civil Society, and Civil Society Reconsidered. So we start following Sama. She was a migrant worker in Dubai who worked a domestic job. Her employer abused and raped her, and when he found out she was pregnant, kicked her out. She soon found herself in jail. Sama described feeling tired and that her job as a nanny was getting harder and harder. She was tired because battling the global and local notions about human trafficking that combined to put undue pressures on female migrants in the UAE. She was tired of the international policies as championed in the Trafficking in Persons TIP report have hindered her efforts to create and mobilize a civil society in the UAE and to meet the needs of the migrant workers. So George Bush and the Americans made trafficking political, which made people think all trafficking is sex work, which led to racism because the notion that Ethiopian women are sex workers who have just been trafficked are criminals. This wasn't always this hard because migrant workers weren't always synonymous with sex worker or trafficking victims. The next section was Dubai Has No Civil Society. They were looking for civil societies as defined by American standards. So an example would be like a billboard campaign or posted websites. However, she wasn't able to find any. She spent time with migrant workers and found large informal movements to meet the needs of migrants in Dubai. There were sentiments in the States that the UAE was not interested in human rights, and she found low rankings in TIP reports, but needed more evidence of active civil societies. Next section was Civil Society Reconsidered. They're asking questions like, what is a civil society? How is it measured? What are the consequences of ignoring both informal and state efforts to mobilize civil society? The definition of a civil society would be the idea of a mediating body acting as an intermediate between the private sphere and the state. Though civil society functions as a check on state power, it also depends on the legal protection of the state in order to survive. While non-governmental organizations can serve as valid indicators of growing civil society and progress along the path to democratization, they do not necessarily demonstrate either. Conversely, a lack of NGOs does not necessarily illustrate a lack of activity or development within the civil realm. So to close this section out, the policies that ignore the existence of civil society as the UAE are not serving the needs of the target population. Section 2 was about the early efforts of the Valley of Love and the Helping Hands movements. So during the development of the UAE, due to oil discovery and the emergence of Dubai as a major trading and financial hub in the Middle East, informal groups began to form to address the needs of the migrant workers in the UAE. So in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, they exasperated from different ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds, which came together with the Emirati to begin creating networks and building civil society initiatives to address labor standards and the lack of social services to meet the needs of non-Emirati. These gatherings were the foundations of 4 organizations: the Valley of Love, Helping Hands, the Villa 25, and the City of Hope. 2 of these groups operate in the UAE to this day. These groups have yet to receive official NGO status in the UAE. However, the members of these groups helped create avenues through civil society in order to address what they perceived as unmet needs in the UAE. Alright, so some information on the Valley of Love. They were created in an informal and spontaneous manner. They had 8 volunteers. They were ranging from Indians, Pakistanis, and British. They shared concerns for a group of female laborers abandoned at a factory that closed down unexpectedly. Vasu, one of the directors of the Valley of Love, is very vocal and animated about the aims of his group. He works for the government of Dubai by day and engages in the volunteer work in the evening. The goal of the group is to help people who want to go home. Today, this group serves mostly men, mainly from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. However, Vasu emphasizes he wants to work with women. It's a very sensitive topic to bring out into the open, typical domestic issue dealing with women, since it is private in Dubai. Organizations that do work with women perceived as victims of sex trafficking in the post-TIP era are under increased scrutiny from the state. The Valley of Love supports itself through private individual donations, but members cannot hold formal fundraising efforts for fear of financial complications or corruption, since they are not an official organization. Their major mode of operating is to distribute their phone numbers at labor camps and to managers at construction sites. And some information on the Helping Hands. They were developed out of a series of small informal gatherings that grew into larger organizations and which continue on day-to-day basis. They were founded by a British husband and wife, Richard and Elizabeth. They moved to the UAE in the early 90s, where Richard was a real estate manager. In October 2006, the Helping Hands became a formal group that has over 100 volunteers and receives support from international groups such as Haider, Madinat, Jumeirah, and other local and global financial organizations. Focuses on matching interested donors with third parties who are in need. Volunteers use their social networks to raise money and also seek out migrant laborers who are in need of food, housing, or financial assistance. Money is also raised to purchase return tickets home for workers, and the Helping Hand is also not official as an NGO in the UAE, so it hinders their ability to officially fundraise on a global level. Then we had Villa 25 in the City of Hope. So Villa 25 was founded by an American in the 80s. It aimed to address needs of women facing abuse. They tried to avoid confrontation, and they had an emphasis on cultural sensitivity. The American founder and several colleagues split due to differences of opinion. And for the City of Hope, it was formed by former Villa 25 members and backed by the MEPI and the U.S. State Department. Unlike the Villa 25, however, they have a confrontational approach. The founder was barred from the UAE and ruined MEPI and the UAE relations. The next section was over local responses to the global policies. And in this section, you read that the UAE was forced to react to the trafficking issues in their borders after the TIP gave them a Tier 3 ranking, which led to the rushing of legislature preventing the forced movement of people within its borders. This also forced the state to acknowledge itself as a trafficking hotspot and to prove that they are capable of handling their borders. Though the TIP has offered recommendations like tightening borders and increasing the police, they have curiously neglected to mention the existence of or merit of the civil society leveled approaches in the state. While the state itself has ignored or co-opted the actions of these informal groups that organizing around the issues. The attempts to curb the human trafficking problem through state involvement have been established through two official organizations: the Dubai Foundation for Women and Children and an unnamed organization operated through the Red Crescent in Abu Dhabi. These groups were fashioned after existing similar Western organizations. So the state has refused to recognize any of the informal groups already working on these issues. Many of the interviewees expressed frustration with the state responses over to the international policies as well as the discourse surrounding them, stating that it has detracted from the existing movements and pushes for more migrants' rights without providing recognition to the informal activists, which have already been lobbying for reform for quite some time. Same as Sama, who expressed fatigue over outreach efforts for the Ethiopian women, Rhonda expressed fatigue over wanting to build a civil society movement but being hindered by the TIP's policies, who will judge the UAE for inadequate civil society responses while ignoring the efforts of organizations like hers. The Bush administration was after a bilateral trade agreement, the 123 agreement, which would grant them a better trading deal with the UAE, so they manipulated the trafficking issue to secure a better deal. Essentially, before the human trafficking issue took center stage, there were several unofficial organizations beginning to sprout and pick up steam, which upon the politicization of these issues by the Bush administration were stifled and lost much of their momentum due to the political discourse and the refusal to acknowledge these organizations by the TIP and the UAE. So the next section was the campaign to promote civil society perseveres. So essentially, even though Dubai has established programs to aid immigrants, laborers, and the trafficked women, they fail to handle their basic needs. Individuals and groups who strive to improve the lives of these groups through bettering living conditions, supplying food and treatments, and aiding them in their return home struggle with fundraising and maintaining a good relationship with the government. The overall concepts in this section exasperates, look to provide outreach, and wish to build a civil society movement that has a good relationship with the state. The government has inefficient programs for laborers, immigrants, or the trafficked women. Those who help may be recognized but not official. They have to be cautious with journalists, they need funding, and they have to follow cultural regulations. Some names to remember from this section were Mustafa, or the Robin Hood of Dubai, Dr. Suparna, and Alexander and Maria. So the next section was common challenges and the collective responses in reaching out. So common challenges. None of the discussed individuals have any background in civil society development. Though many organizations work with the government, they are not official. The law which prohibits the creation of unions has hindered the registration of the NGOs. Thus, all of these organizations either register in other countries or work on an informal basis. Because none of these groups are formal organizations, they can be called upon by government entities without being granted recognition, so there is always a constant threat of being shut down. Additionally, they lack the ability to have avenues to criticize the government without having official status. Officializing these organizations would also help, because these organizations would be held to certain standards by law and would allow organizations to formally hold each other accountable. For example, the potential exploitation of abused women in the organization of the City of Hope likely wouldn't have been curtailed if they were an official organization that was held to the UAE law. Instead, the founders were never prosecuted. Okay, so that was the basic rundown of the chapter. I think I'm running out of time, so just some questions to consider. You can see them there on screen. Just take a look at them. And yeah, that was chapter 6.